Okay, so tell me again, this is the A plus thing?
Mhm.
And this is a class or just
It's
like
a study session.
okay.
See here, look, you can see what it looks like.
Anything too loud?
Since I'm not presenting, I'll actually be muted most of the time.
Okay. Oh, okay, for AP Psych, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did you put that together?
I didn't do this one. But then when you're in the Zoom session, you just share it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gives the kids a code so they can join it.
So do they just read it on their own? I mean, do you?
No, we actually like go through it with them.
Oh, okay.
And it has like areas where they can type in a response and then we score them.
Okay.
Like we give them feedback.
Yeah.
So it's like a real-time study session.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, this is basically taking me a back way onto Pulaski Pike. And yeah, that puts me in Tennessee, and then I merge onto 65 from there. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so instead of going left, like back toward public, you'll go right, because this big road is Patterson.
Okay.
And Patterson goes around, and you'll see, like, I know you've seen the pictures I posted, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it says turn right on Patterson Lane.
So Patterson goes, it curves around, and then you're on Pulaski Pike. That takes you, it's probably taking you to what? Is it 265? What is that? 261?
It just says turn sharp right onto Pulaski Pike and then turn right onto AL 53 North for 12 miles. And then you'll enter Tennessee that way. And then you take the ramp to Nashville and merge onto 65 North.
Okay.
So it's 107 miles. That'll be great. Because I'm going to actually go ahead and go to the hotel first and leave my car. Yeah, so see, I figured there had to be a way to go north and merge in. So that's exactly what it's doing. Perfect. You can either do that or you can take 431 up to Fayetteville and go over. So either way. But yeah, it's saying this is 107 miles. So that's perfect.
So about Macy, I don't think, Danielle, that they ever had her out. Like, I don't think she was ever around other dogs, which I think is why she's so territorial, you know?
Probably.
Because, I mean, she's not this aggressive looking, like
She just came up and laid her head on my arm. Yeah.
Over the last couple of days, she's been putting her paws, she hasn't pet me, like she puts her paws on me. If I'm rubbing her, petting her, you know, and then I stop for a second, she's nudging my hand, or she lifts my hand again, you know, with her nose.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's a big color.
All right. I'm going to text Rebecca and let her know I'm in.
Okay, we have the comments. She absolutely loves ice cream, Danielle. So I'm hoping I would eat ice cream not long after we have her. And I mean, she's sitting there like, you know, after I just have some kind of vanilla, you know, whatever. And I gave it to her. Like the last of whatever was in my cup of bowl. Honey, she ate it like nobody's business. And I texted that lady, her name is Blake, you know her from? Blake, you don't believe this. She loved ice cream. She's like, that's what it is. And I was sending pictures of like stuff we did with her, gave her, you know, she was like, oh, so glad y'all, this is awesome, you know. But she never did tell me what she was mixed with. And I haven't taken her to a vet yet. So I haven't gotten a record, you know? I don't know if she knows for sure. George doing anything when you're gone?
As little as possible. I cleaned up the kitchen and even did laundry before I left, so he wouldn't have to do any of it.
I didn't know if like he visits with his family or.
Shouldn't have.
Whatever.
I mean, Florence came over yesterday, but literally I waited to get on the treadmill so I could visit with her. Georgia's on his laptop and she's on her phone, and I said, I waited to get on the treadmill so we could actually visit, and y'all are both sitting here on devices. And she's like, well, his dad and Patsy don't give a shit what's going on with us. We never hear from them, but we get to see the lovely photos posted of them with Jenny and Mark at lunch. We never get invited to that shit, which, you know, George is like, to be fair, I wouldn't want to go. It's like, okay, well, that is fair. But I mean, it is what it is.
When are they going to lunch? What do you mean?
So on Sundays, eat brunch at Kroger's.
Oh, they still do that?
Mhm.
Oh.
Not every Sunday, but oh yeah.
And what about Florence? Any news? Working? Is she still going out and partying and all?
God.
Okay.
Those days are firmly behind her. I mean, she just doesn't have it in her anymore. Oh, speak the devil. Yeah, she's been all concerned about what we're getting Terry Jack, you know, because Terry just lost his mom and his stepdad had just died. Yeah. So I mean, it's been a rough time for him, and I totally get that. I've checked on him. We took him lunch over there because he lives right down the street from us. We took him lunch over there, and he had the flu. Yeah, his mom's house is like 2 miles from us.
Oh wow.
So we took him lunch over there because he felt like he might have the flu. But you know, Florence was like, I'm trying to figure out what to get Terry Jackson for Christmas. I said, yeah, I was thinking about that too. She said, well, he really likes nutcrackers. And I was like, huh, okay. So coincidentally, I'm on this, I get this email, Brad's Deals, that tells me like about, yeah, okay. Well, they had Macy's nutcrackers for like $20. So I was like, oh, let me see what they have. And they had a Wizard of Oz set of nutcrackers. So I was like, oh my God, I'm getting him the Dorothy nutcracker. It was like, but she decided to order a set from Belk, and she's like, they're $80, but I have $60 in Belk rewards points. And I said, oh, okay, well, I'll give you $10 on them. And she's like, $10. I said, well, according to you, you're going to pay 20 for them. Well, I wasn't going to use all my rewards points. I said, me using your card's how you get those rewards points, isn't it?
Now can you hear me?
I can.
Yay. Sorry, I had to wait for the goof troop to get in, and you can hear them, I'm sure.
I'm at my friend's dining room table, so
Good deal.
I'm in Huntsville tonight.
Okay, hold.
But anyway, so I told her, I said, I'll give you $20 toward them, but like, we're not getting nuts here. So she was like, well, okay. She said, I went on and ordered, so it should come to the house before party, and I will get price adjustment and double discount. Okay. You were way more worried about it than I was, because George was like, you're getting him an $80 gift. Well, I'm not really paying $80 for it. It's like, that sounds like a guilty conscience. I normally get him like a $20 gift, if anything.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But is that the whole set, all the characters?
Mm-hmm.
But it'll be from all of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Still.
I thought the ones that were at Macy's were cuter, but keep calling this.
Yeah. Well. Macy's, leave her alone.
Not really, but. What's she on there? You can't even see it. My screen's tilted up. All you can see is the window. You can't see it. Look, come here. You can. See, that's all you can see.
Okay.
Hello. Okay. All right, so it looks like you, yeah, you got in and everything's good to go.
Yeah, I don't know what was
Where you
going
are.
on with Jill the other night. I don't know where the problem was.
I know, and that's, I do hate that because it's hard for me to troubleshoot because I'm like, it doesn't do that to me. You know what I mean? Everybody's like stuff, and especially like if you guys are working from your school, I really feel like there's a lot that goes on with different systems IT, you know, that does.
Yeah, and see, I think she was in her classroom. I was at home.
Yeah, so
So that may have been a problem.
I always present from home, and so I can't anticipate, you know, IT shenanigans. So yeah, I don't know. It's crazy. All right. Do you want to stay host?
It doesn't matter.
Okay. I do not care. All right. And you still want me to be the primary, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that way we'll both have access to the chat, right? That won't mess with anything, will it?
You mean the slide deck?
No, the chat for the Zoom.
Oh yeah, we both should be
Okay.
able to. Yeah, I meant on presenting. You still wanted me to present?
If you can.
I can.
Do you need me to do it?
Well, I know that you didn't know whether or not you would be able to, and so I said that.
Is John Cole gonna be home, Brandy?
Because you see this thing it's distraction number one. It's on the bar in there. But yeah, I absolutely can. I have it pulled up, ready to go. It's up to you.
I promise I'm good either way. You just need to let me know if you're gonna. You said you've already got the Pear Deck pulled up,
I do.
so you just
I
need to
mean,
invite me as a co-teacher. I mean, I can still present it, but if you want to go ahead and have it pulled up, just send me the link to be a co-teacher. That's fine too.
Okay.
I don't mind doing the talking, in other words.
Yes, that's what I wanted to know. Yes.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay.
You know, I'm a talker.
Yes. I don't mind either. I'm just worried about the 2-year-old.
I promise it's all good. Although if she pops in and makes appearances in the back, I do love that. That cracks me up.
Yes.
I remember having a little one. Vaguely, but I remember.
There was a time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, why is this taking forever? It says it is syncing my presentation.
If you need me to hop on and do it, I've already got the Pear Deck pulled up.
Yeah, you queue up yours and
Okay.
then because mine is here, I'll show you what mine's doing. Does it ever give you this?
Oh no, I've never seen that.
Yep, it's just, I mean, it could be that it's just being funky. But I have not opened Pear Deck in a long time.
Yeah, I'm opening it right now.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll just invite you as co-teacher, and you want me to send it to your email, put it in the chat box? What do you want me to do?
Yeah, you can just send it to my you can just drop it in the chat.
Okay. Opening it right now.
Okay, yeah, it works now. It just, I think it was freaking out. Like you do.
All right. I'm
And
opening
I had not realized that I had failed to change the survey link to the right survey. at the end. So I went through and did that to the remaining study sessions.
Oh, so the link I posted Tuesday night wasn't the right one? Oh,
I
shoot.
think so. I think, or maybe I changed that one and then did not change the rest of them, but I wouldn't imagine I did that. Let's see what I did. Yep, it was totally not the right one.
Well, shoot.
That's okay. That was my fault. Because I don't ever think about that link not working.
Okay. Invite co-teacher. Okay, Mason.
Yeah. So yeah, as far as the free responses go,
I just dropped it in the chat.
yep, I got it. Yep, I'm in.
Okay. All right, let me put the join code back up there. Okay. So when I was looking over the scoring guidelines for the FRQs, and I know it was just kind of going off of like what had been in previous ones, some of them looked like the names were off. Were you just literally like copying and pasting from old scoring guidelines?
It was a literal copy paste.
Okay,
So
I was just double checking.
Yeah, so I didn't go back and change them in any way.
Okay.
Now I did change the actual questions to what.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So the first one I kind of changed the prompt a little bit just to be a little different, but it should still work the same. It just
with the artists instead of the capital cities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I liked your suggestion on the second content application one for the like additional aspect of it. And so that's why I took away some from the original one to make room for those 2 points there at the bottom. So I kind of combined two of those. And that's where I kind of was going with that research one, but.
Well, I saw you'd added in that extra information for p-value, because since it tells you at the end of one of them that the results were statistically significant, I was like, well, this would be a good way to work p-value in.
And that is the literal verbiage used in this past year's, the second. So I was like,
and I know that through it shouldn't have, we've had this conversation, but I know that threw a lot of people for a loop, and I'm not going to sit there smug, but I'm thinking my kids knew p-value, and I'm not a science teacher. It's not, you know, I think people just, I really think just the wording itself gets people so anxiety, you know, riddled, but it's like, you're not asking them to calculate it. They just need to know what it is and be able to discuss it with some competence. Every kid can do that. Absolutely. But not if you don't ever talk about it.
Yes.
And I suspect that's where some of that comes from, is it's like, you're not necessarily seeing across the board, you're not necessarily seeing weak spots with kids, you're seeing weak spots with teachers, where it's like, okay, I'm not comfortable talking about this, so we're not going to. And then they get popped.
And that's, you know, and that's something that I'm hoping through the last 2 years or so, we've slowly been able to, you know, integrate that into all the PD that we've been doing. And that was my whole point about the fall conference. I was like, the kids don't need to be able to do this, but we as teachers have to be confident in our own ability to understand so that we feel comfortable teaching about it, just like anything else that we do, you know? So yeah, I mean, it's work in progress, but I feel like the more we push it and the more we integrate it, I'm hoping that did something. I don't know. All right, what am I doing? Oh yeah, there we go. Yes, so the structure of the table, the second table is exactly the way that it was done in this year's past FRQs. And explain what the p-value allows the researcher to conclude about the study. I ripped that straight from the thing. Now, all I did was increase the data set for the table so that they could do the median.
Okay.
So the time they blew the horn, the original only had like, the 3 per whatever. And so I just increased that number so that I could generate a mean and a standard deviation. And then I just made up that p-value. I didn't actually run any tests, but it's fine.
Yeah.
And then, because I liked that. And then I added in your suggestion about the sampling, but we're going to need to talk a little bit about that, the wording of that question, because I want to make sure that's going to make sense to students.
Okay.
So do you have I'm going to be because I want to finish getting up another unit onto Canvas this weekend. So I'm going to be working probably the majority of the day Saturday, because I'm already presenting. Am I presenting with you Saturday? Who am I presenting with?
I'm an alternate. I think it's Jenny.
Yes. Okay. So I'm Jenny's backup there. So I'm already going to be doing that, and then I'll probably just keep working. But
I will be at social studies conference, but it's really easy for me to step aside, and I have Zoom on my phone. So that's why I said I can Zoom with you at any point over the weekend. It won't be an issue. Because I literally have these pulled up on my phone right now. So
okay. But these are not due to run until after the first of the year. So it's not like we've got a huge rush. That's why I was like, I've got some time next week. I know when's y'all's last day of school?
December 15th. Are you talking about before Christmas break?
Yes.
Yeah, December 15th.
December 15th. Okay, because I figured you might want some of that time to kind of dive into the rubric part, of it. So I don't want to distract from your conference. I have, I'm in the office pretty much not all week. What did I say?
This is a bunch of sessions I'm going to that I've been able to go down the agenda and pick, kind of like with fall conference, I've been able to pick what applies to me. So like I said, don't worry about it.
Okay. Well then, so when Saturday do you prefer?
So y'all have the study session from 10 to 11. You want to say either before the study session or right after?
Yes.
Since you'll already be on Zoom anyway?
Yes.
Okay.
That will work.
Either one works for me. So just let me know what your preference is. Okay. I can log on 8:30, 9 o'clock that morning, or hop on at 11:15.
Okay. Yeah, that'll work.
But that'll be easy. Like I said, that'll be easy to be flexible. Because a lot of the really good psych sessions are actually tomorrow anyway. Mm-hmm. Saturday's kind of hit or miss.
Mm-hmm.
There's some other stuff, that I'll go to that I can work into seminar. But like I said, the bulk of the good meaty AP psych sessions are Friday. And Feinberg is presenting, I think, tomorrow at 10:45 or 11. So
what conference is this?
National Council for the Social Studies.
Ah, okay. That sounds like a fun one.
It's the first time I've been able to go in 10 years because it's somewhere within driving distance. The next 3 years it's Boston, DC, and then Chicago. I'm not going to get funding to fly to those, but I can drive. Right. So But like 10 years ago, it was in New Orleans, so I was able to go to that one. But I mean, this definitely isn't something I can go to every year. And
Mhm.
to be fair, I don't really feel like there's not a need for me to go every year. I do a lot of professional development aside
Mhm.
from that, but especially kind of want to hear if there might be some additional information about the redesign.
Yes, yes, it would be nice for them. Tell us something. I know this is probably not really affecting you so much, but you know a lot more social studies folks than I do. But anybody, kind of gearing up for the course of study rewrites that are hitting next year? Okay.
Not that I've heard.
Okay. So yeah, I'm interested to see how that's going to play out. Because we just got done with science and social studies is next, and not too many crazies came out of the woodwork, but I'm interested to see considering all the kind of the political climate, it's an election year, all the other things about social studies courses that have been hot topics. Yeah, I'm going to be interested to know how that goes for our state rewriting.
Well, I have to say, most of the people that I directly interact with are AP social studies.
AP.
Like my department chair is AP GoPo and AP Macro. So I don't really hear a whole lot about like on level courses and things like that in terms of course of study changes. So I don't know. I'm kind of out of touch with that piece of it.
Yeah, that's all I know is AP teachers, obviously. So yeah, I don't know much about it, but I feel for whoever it is that has to sit on that committee, because I think it's going to be rough.
But the crazies come out of the woodwork for everything. I mean, when ELA redesigned, there were people up in arms about that. So
How? Why?
it is what it is.
Right. It's just
But
crazy.
I don't know. I don't consider myself to be ultra liberal or anything, but I do tend to be pretty open minded. And it's like, I mean, you can feel however you want to feel about it, but at the end of the day, you have to teach it the way it happened. And we know the way it actually happened. A colleague of mine, and she's ELA, gave her students a Newsella article. So this is through Newsella. Gave them a Newsella article about changing Thanksgiving Day or changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And one of her parents was up in arms about, I can't believe you're assigning an article that's attacking one of our founders. And it's like, okay, so this person's not even well versed in history if you think Columbus is one of our founders.
One of our founders.
He didn't discover anything. I got bad news for you. There are already people here.
There was already, he was Spanish, I don't know what to say to that.
It cracks me up. But I mean, that's,
right.
That's the kind of ignorance, frankly, that you're going up against. I mean, no different than what there is in AP Psych with the whole gender and sexual orientation unit. I mean, come on. We're not indoctrinating these children.
Right. Like we don't have enough on the plate that I'm coming up with indoctrination schemes. Yes.
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, now, like last year, I had one of my AP Psych classes, I had a student who started the year as Michaela, and by the end of the year, he was Aaron. And everybody was okay with that, And he even came up to me at the end of it and made like a 5 on the exam, of course, but came up to me at the end of the class, like at the end of the year, and said, I was in on-level psych, and apparently the second day of class, the general psych teacher, who is of course a coach, made some really derogatory comments about, you can't change gender. And it's like, she said, I appreciated the fact that you were very clear about the distinction between this is biological sex and this is gender. Because I literally put a picture of a pink bedroom and a blue bedroom up on the screen and say, what does biology have to do with this?
Yes.
Tell me there's not a social element here.
Right.
But I mean, we don't get, crazy with it or anything. It's just, I don't know. I think most of the time people that get upset about it really don't know what's going on anyway. So
right. Oh yeah.
But I'm sure I'll kind of listen out for some chatter this week, because there's actually a meetup tomorrow that Blake Busman has organized at a
Okay.
restaurant in downtown Nashville for all the Alabama social studies teachers.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll hear some chatter there.
Oh yeah, because
But Blake's one, he doesn't suffer fools gladly.
Yes.
So I have a feeling he would shut a lot of that down pretty quickly. So
right, yes, yeah, I think that was my experience, at least with how we handled some of that stuff from the science side. But yeah.
But sorry, I know I got us off track. Getting back to that FRQ with the sampling issue with the punching bag one, was that I was looking at. I mean, I saw several different things. For one thing, like there's not a lot of discussion about where the students came from. There's very few of them. So I felt like there were maybe some different areas that we could kind of like decide what direction we wanted to go in with that. If we wanted to keep that one, decide kind of what direction we wanted to go in with that. But I feel like maybe that's another area that students are still kind of struggling with.
Yes.
Like sampling bias, sampling,
Exactly. And I liked, yes. And I didn't know, right. I did not know whether or not it would make more sense to the kids if we did say something like, because right now I have explained how sampling could affect the results of the study. I almost really wanted to say, explain how sampling bias is not shown in this study, but related to this study, or you know what I mean? Like I didn't know if the way that like explain how sampling could affect the results of this study was good enough to direct a student into answering or considering it the way that they need to consider it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to say more like, how does sampling bias apply to this study or I don't know. That was really the one that I was kind of, because I liked your suggestion. I put in your suggestion about displaced aggression. I thought that was really good. I just didn't know if explain how sampling could affect the results of the study, if that was better than explain how sampling bias applies to this research study. I didn't know which one would direct the students better in answering.
I kind of like sampling bias because then I think that gives them a little more area to maneuver, but you're going to know pretty easily if that kid knows what they're talking about and how they specifically apply it to the study. And I'll tell you that displaced aggression, that's a term right out of the AMSCO book. So I figured there can't be a lot of gray area there. Every program teacher has those AMSCO books, and I hope they're using them. I mean, I literally did an assignment for mine with the AMSCO book.
I like that here. I thought that was a good substitute. What about, because you're going to give this, right, to your kids?
Yeah, and that was actually going to be my next question. When do I need to have, refresh my memory, when do I need to have samples ready?
That doesn't have to be done until whatever Rhonda's print deadline is going to be for the mock exam reading, which is usually like, what, early March?
That's what I was thinking. It was like maybe second week of March last year, because I have mine on track to be done with the content by like March 16th, maybe. So yeah, that'd be fine because they'll have covered, we'll have been through all 9 units at least once. So yeah, that's fine.
I almost was like, I wonder if you could give like half of them the one wording and the other half the other wording.
And see what I got.
But I didn't know if
My
that was
only
gonna-
fear with that is, my numbers are low this year. I've only got
Yeah.
42 total. That's the only reason. Now, last year would have been great with 70 of them, but I would worry about this year. No, it's okay. You want me to move?
Yeah, I say,
I just don't want to be annoyed.
yeah, I say we go with. Let me put this in parentheses so we can kind of talk more about it on Saturday. Okay, I'm gonna say the concept of, yeah, maybe then. All right, and then we can talk about it. Okay, do you want them to start coming in about 5 minutes before?
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm putting go to joinpd.com in the chat.
And when we get to FRQ, do you want me to start from the bottom and you start from the top?
Sure. Because I forgot to ask Jill about that, so I had to text her. I was like, am I starting from the top or the bottom?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fine. Where are we on time? Oh, okay, we still got 7 more minutes till it's 5 till. I'm waiting. See anything goes over my kids. Oh, I'll be fine.
All right, I'm gonna start, yeah, I'm gonna start letting them in.
All right, welcome everybody. As you're coming in, make sure you're going to joinpd.com and you're going to want to enter the code that's on the screen to get into the Pear Deck session. So let's try to go ahead and get that done so we can get started right at 7 o'clock. And again, that's joinpd.com and you'll enter the code that's on the screen, but it is also in the chat box for you. We'll get started in about 4 more minutes. And again, if you're just joining the session, you want to go to joinpd.com and enter the code that is on the screen. Like I said, it's also in the chat box. Like I said, we'll get started in about 3 more minutes. Did we say top? Top? Okay. Just reminding myself. All right, again, we're going to get started in about 2 more minutes. Joinpd.com, and then the code on the screen will get you into the session. All right, it is 7 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started so we can get you guys out of the session on time. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Danielle Seymour. I teach at Baker High School in Mobile, Alabama, although tonight I'm coming to you from lovely Huntsville, Alabama. And my co-host this evening is Rebecca Thrash. So if you have any questions as we go through the session, if you would just put those in the chat box, that way we can make sure that we're able to keep progressing. So we will go ahead and get started with this question. Which statement best describes you at the moment? So you're going to want to drag the icon to whichever one of those statements really describes where you are right now, especially if this isn't, material that you've covered just yet in your class, or maybe you're still working your way through. All right, looks like a lot of you are confident or very confident, so that's great. I'm guessing probably at this point in the year material you've already at least partially covered with your teacher. So what are we going to be talking about in this study session? We're going to be looking at classical and operant conditioning. So two major foundational elements of that learning unit, very, very important. We're going to discuss the differences between reinforcement and punishment, hopefully alleviate some of the confusion you might be feeling, especially between things like negative reinforcement and punishment. And we'll also look at some of those partial and intermittent reinforcement schedules. We will then move on and talk about some of the types and processes of memory and discuss some of the factors that influence memory. And if you've been in one of these sessions before, before we finish, you'll have the chance to actually answer an FRQ and get feedback. So let's go ahead and get started with learning. So let's start off with a question just to kind of see where you're at and what you're comfortable with. 4-year-old Scott fell down the stairs at his grandmother's house. Although he was not badly hurt, he was very frightened. Now, whenever his parents mention visiting his grandmother's house, he feels anxious and fearful. In classical conditioning terms, what are the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus in the scenario, respectively? So take just a moment and answer this question, and then we'll go over the correct answer and talk a little bit through it. Make sure you're reading the question carefully. All right, so in this scenario, the correct answer is B, because we were looking for the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. So you would want the conditioned stimulus first. In this case, it would be his grandmother's house. The unconditioned stimulus would be the one that naturally prompted those fears and anxiety. Since he fell down at his grandmother's house, it makes sense that that would incite those feelings. So let's talk about the classical conditioning model. And if you've been through this unit, then I'm sure your teacher has discussed with you that classical conditioning and operant conditioning are types of associative learning, because you're learning to associate one thing with another. In classical conditioning, you're associating two stimuli together, and then it prompts a response. So this model may look familiar to you, especially if you've talked about Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. In that first box, you can see before conditioning, the dog food is an unconditioned stimulus, and that's going to be anything that prompts a natural response. So here the dog food is placed in front of the dog, and the dog would, of course, salivate. Very similar to what you as a human would do if somebody puts your favorite food in front of you. So before conditioning, there's a whistle blown. Now, normally a whistle or a bell would be an neutral stimulus, because it's not going to prompt any response. The dog's not going to salivate. It's not going to do anything because it's not associating that whistle with anything. But in box 3, during conditioning, you can see the whistle is blown, the food is presented, and then the dog salivates. So that consistent pairing of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus is going to lead to the conditioned response. So I want you to kind of pay attention to the changes that happen here. You can see the unconditioned stimulus doesn't change, but that neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response eventually becomes the conditioned response. And that might be a helpful framework for keeping this straight and remembering, although you're really talking about 5 things, 2 of them will stay the same, okay? So when we talk about John Watson, and some of you are probably already familiar with his little Albert experiments, he also focused on classical conditioning, but he was more involved with observable behaviors. So when you look at this little Albert classical conditioning experiment or classical conditioning study, take a minute and identify the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. Okay, so much like with Pavlov, this is one of the more notable classical conditioning studies. Like I said, this is one that a lot of people, even that aren't familiar with psychology, are familiar with. So when we think about that unconditioned stimulus, again, you always want to focus on what would prompt an involuntary response, what would prompt a natural response. Well, if anyone heard a loud bang, that would probably startle them. So we can see that the unconditioned stimulus is that loud bang. The unconditioned response would get it being scared and startled from the bang. So then we have to focus on, well, what's the neutral stimulus here? Well, the white rat would be the neutral stimulus. When it's paired with the loud bang, however, it becomes the conditioned stimulus, and that prompts that conditioned response. And you can see those changes taking place here. Now, unfortunately, with little Albert, not only did he become afraid of white rats, but that fear was then generalized to virtually anything furry. White rats, puppies, bunny rabbits, even inanimate objects like a fur coat or a Santa Claus mask. So when we think about generalization, sometimes that fear or that response isn't just to that one specific stimulus. It becomes generalized to anything that's very similar to that. Now, if we had a situation where, for example, Albert was only afraid of white rats, then that would be a discriminatory response. He's discriminating amongst those stimuli. Another important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this classical conditioning model is something called spontaneous recovery. So let's say if we use this example, eventually little Albert, after the rat is no longer paired with that steel bar being hit with the hammer, eventually little Albert doesn't exhibit that fear response to the white rat. Spontaneous recovery could still happen, in which we have the reappearance of that response after a rest period. Because extinction is what's going to happen when we no longer have that pairing taking place. Much like we just looked at with Pavlov and the dogs. If you stop pairing the whistle and the food, eventually the dog is probably not going to respond to the whistle anymore. All right, so let's take a look at another question. A cancer patient becomes nauseated following chemotherapy treatments. After a few treatments, the patient begins having a sick feeling whenever entering the treatment room. The treatment room has become. All right, excellent. It looks like just about everybody was on the right track with this one. So obviously this cancer patient's becoming nauseous as a result of the chemotherapy treatments. So if we use that same classical conditioning model here, the chemotherapy treatments would be the unconditioned stimulus, and the nausea, of course, would be the unconditioned response. But eventually that room that they're in for the treatment it's a neutral stimulus, but it becomes that conditioned stimulus that also prompts the nausea. So good job. All right, now let's change course just a little bit, and we're going to talk about a man named Edward Thorndike and his law of effect. So imagine that you arrive to work early one day, and it's purely by accident, not something you planned. But your boss notices that you arrived early, and he praises you throughout the day for your diligence. That praise is likely going to make you feel good because everybody likes a pat on the back. So that praise is going to make you feel good, and you're probably going to continue to arrive early to work. That praise acted as a reinforcer for the behavior. So you start showing up for work a little bit earlier each day because you want to keep receiving your boss's praise. That's essentially what Edward Thorndike proposed with the law of effect, that behaviors that are followed by favorable outcomes, like a reinforcement, are going to be more likely to occur again. But the opposite is also true. If a behavior was followed by a punitive outcome, like a punishment, let's say you were late to work, and instead of your boss, patting you on the back, they threaten to fire you if you're late one more time. So we stop the behaviors that get punished. In other words, we learn to do less of what doesn't work and more of what does work for us. That's essentially what Edward Thorndike was proposing with his law of effect. So when we think about reinforcement versus punishment, and let's just start with the very simple concepts of reinforcement and punishment, because both of them have an impact on behavior, but they do it in different ways. One of them increases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur, and one of them decreases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur. So which is reinforcement and which is punishment? Take a few moments and type your response in the box. All right, a couple of you are still typing, so take about 1 more minute and finish your response. All right, so it looks like most of you recognize that reinforcement is the one that increases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur, and punishment is the one that decreases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur. And if you can just keep that basic framework straight, it's actually going to make it a lot easier when we start talking about the negative and positive aspect associated with reinforcement and punishment. So, just like we can't talk about classical conditioning without talking about John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov, we really can't talk about operant conditioning without talking about B.F. Skinner. So some of you may be familiar with B.F. Skinner, did operant conditioning studies for literally decades. He worked with pigeons, with rats. He constructed a Skinner box in which the rat would press a lever and get a food reward or a water reward. And what B.F. Skinner was really trying to figure out is how behavior could be controlled by reinforcement. He was a big believer in behavioral observable responses, much like John B. Watson. Even though they used different methods, they were both behaviorists because they were focused on the observable response. So when we think about it that way, it makes sense that when we're looking at operant conditioning, this would be an observable behavior, something that would either be reinforced or something that would be punished, literally something that would continue or something that would stop. So when we look at this reinforcement or punishment, you can use different types of schedules to determine like what the outcome is going to be on that behavior. So let's take a minute and look at another question. Children who are consistently praised for receiving high grades in school will likely continue to work for high grades. Using an operant conditioning explanation of this phenomenon, which of the following is true? All right, excellent. As it looks like all of you figured out, A is the correct response. That praise is functioning as a positive reinforcer. So this is an important point. When we think about positive and negative, I'll go ahead and advance. When we think about positive and negative, we want to kind of get rid of that idea that positive means good and negative means bad, and instead think of it more like you would in math. Positive being the addition of something, negative being the taking away of something. So whether we apply it to reinforcement or punishment, it's always going to be the same. Positive is adding something, negative is taking away. So let's start by looking at it in a reinforcement model. Positive reinforcement would be encouraging a certain behavior by offering a positive stimulus. Here it would be a reward. So the way I explain this to my students is if you're positively reinforcing a behavior, you're adding something beneficial like praise or money. There can be different types of reinforcers. Now, negative reinforcement, remember, we're talking about reinforcement, so this is still encouraging a particular behavior, but here we would be doing so by taking away something unpleasant. I don't know about some of you, but when my daughter was a teenager, really one of the only disagreements we ever had was over the status of her room. She was not a very clean person. So I found that a lot of times she would just, kind of clean her room because she didn't want to hear me nag her about it anymore. So in that instance, the negative reinforcement seemed to work really well because once she started cleaning her room, mom stopped nagging. So in that case, I was reinforcing the behavior I wanted, cleaning the room, by taking away something negative or something unpleasant for her, an aversive stimulus. But here's where a lot of students tend to get confused because they confuse negative reinforcement with punishment. That's why I said, a few minutes ago when we were looking at this, if you can just keep in mind that reinforcement, think about a reinforcer, what it would do, like reinforced steel or reinforced concrete. It's strengthening something. And that's what reinforcement does. It encourages or strengthens a behavior. The positive and negative aspect is a secondary thing. If you see the word reinforcement, then whatever the behavior is, we want to strengthen it. We want to encourage it. We're just doing so by either adding something pleasant or taking away something unpleasant. The same is true for punishment. Now, punishment discourages a behavior. So, think about maybe some of the things that you might do that your parents don't want you to do anymore, like maybe making bad grades or staying out past your curfew. So in a negative punishment, they would remove something that you like or something desirable in order to discourage the behavior. So let's say you break curfew and your mom takes away your cell phone. That would be a negative punishment because I'm guessing your cell phone is something desirable. So by taking that away, it's still discouraging that behavior of staying out past your curfew. Positive punishment, since we're still talking about punishment, we're still looking to discourage the undesirable behavior, but here we're doing it by giving something undesirable. Now, I'm guessing if you miss curfew, your mom's probably not going to give you an electric shock. But, maybe she gives you a stern talking to or a scolding. And, for that matter, let's throw dad in there as well, because we don't want to just make it sound like moms are the ones who are always on your case. But anything that would be added that is unpleasant would still be a punishment because it's discouraging whatever the problem behavior is, but it's doing so by adding something. So again, when you think about positive and negative, when it comes to reinforcement or punishment, you just want to think about it as either an addition sign or a subtraction sign, not good or bad, okay? All right, when we think about reinforcement schedules, so this was another part of the work of B.F. Skinner, because he clearly figured out that you could reinforce behaviors and those behaviors would continue, but then he wondered, well, did the reinforcement need to be given constantly? What would happen if you changed the timing of the reinforcement, or how many behaviors had to be completed before the reinforcement would be given? So he devised ratio schedules and interval schedules, and that's what you see on the graph in front of you. A ratio schedule is like the ratio of responses to reinforcers. On a fixed schedule, a fixed ratio schedule, there's a certain number of behaviors that you have to complete in order to get the reinforcer. And those little black pegs you see on the lines are when the reinforcers are being given. So you can see there's a very consistent pattern there. After a certain number of behaviors are completed, the reinforcement's given. With variable ratio, this time it's not clear how many behaviors need to be completed, but when those behaviors are completed at some random or changing time, a reinforcement is still going to be given. Now, if we look at interval, anytime we're talking about interval, whether it's fixed or variable, this is going to be based on an increment of time. So an amount of time that passes, you can see on that red line, those black dots still, those black pegs still represent the reinforcements. You can see that they're coming at very consistent points after a certain period of time. Now, what you may also see is there's a peak in response every time a reinforcement is coming. So that also shows that there's rapid responding anytime that reinforcement is near, because on a fixed schedule, the person is going to know when that reinforcement's coming. With variable interval, you can see there's very steady responding. Again, because it's variable, it's changing or random. You don't know how much time is going to go by before a reinforcement is given. So it creates a steady rate of responding, okay? So a couple of other things to take away from this. With continuous reinforcement, that's not what we're looking at here. These are partial or intermittent reinforcement schedules. Continuous reinforcement is exactly what it sounds like. You would just get reinforced every time you completed a behavior. So if we're looking at a partial or intermittent reinforcement schedule, like what's on the graph, then you can see, based on what we're looking at here, partial or intermittent reinforcement, is reinforcing a desired behavior only part of the time, and learning takes longer. All right, you can see based on the way these lines are going with the number of responses on that y-axis and then the time on the x-axis. So what's interesting is with that variable ratio, look at how almost straight that line is. And one of the best examples of a variable ratio schedule is gambling. Somebody who's playing a slot machine, for example, you know, they just keep pulling away and pulling away. They have no idea if that machine's going to hit a jackpot or pay them anything. They don't know when they're going to get a reinforcement, so they just keep playing and playing and playing. And you can see that is the one that's quickest to pick up, and it just seems to last. So let's look at these schedules of reinforcement, and you can see you have 4 options here. Take a minute and see if you can identify which one is a fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval schedule of reinforcement. You may just want to choose to use the numbers when you're indicating whether they are fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, or variable interval, and you can certainly just use the abbreviations as well. All right, guys. Here we go. Okay, so as most of you indicated, example 1 would be a fixed ratio. You're earning frequent flyer miles, meaning the more often you fly, the more you're going to earn that reinforcement. When we're looking at a variable ratio, playing bingo, you have to play in order to get the reinforcement, but you have no idea when your number is going to get called. Now, 3 and 4, if you're looking across, are both based on an interval because they're both based on an increment of time. Now, if you're getting a salary increase every year, that would be a fixed interval because it's happening every single year. You're getting the reinforcement every year. But if it's going fishing, you're sitting out there on the boat or whatever, you don't know how much time is going to go by before you finally get a nibble, okay? All right, so we're going to change course just a little bit and move on to memory. Although if you think about it, learning and memory actually have a lot in common, and we'll talk about a little bit of that. But let's start off with another multiple choice question. According to the information processing view of memory, the first stage in memory processing involves. All right, it looks like for the most part, most of you correctly identified D, encoding, but I did see that there was some kind of debate between retrieval and encoding. So when we're thinking about the information processing view, this is what we're looking at, that 3-step process. And we have to encode the information before we can store it and then retrieve it. So when we're looking at that information processing model, encoding is the process of actually putting things into memory in the first place. Storage is exactly what it sounds like, how we're storing them, whether it's in short-term or long-term memory. And then retrieval would be the process of bringing that memory back to consciousness. Now, the other model of memory that we're going to talk about is the Atkinson-Shiffrin multiple stage model of memory. And there's still some overlap here. Like, this isn't necessarily something completely different. It's just looking at, you can see sensory memory is there. And you can see between sensory memory and here we're looking at working memory. There's something that says attended input. What that literally means is, according to this model of memory, we have to pay attention to something in order to move it from sensory memory to our working memory. If no attention is paid to it, then it likely isn't going to be encoded and stored. Like if we, see a group of faces in a crowd, we may not pay attention to any of them and not be able to recall them later on. So that's a key difference here. What we focus our attention on is then encoded into short-term memory. And then long-term memory is like a second round of encoding. And we'll talk about different types of encoding, but one of the strongest is going to be semantic encoding. If we're not only paying attention to something, but then making meaning of it, that's going to be even more powerful than if we just simply rehearse the information. So think of it this way: when you're studying your vocabulary for AP Psychology, a lot of you may use Quizlet, and that's a great tool. It's sort of like virtual flashcards. So that would be a great tool for rehearsing the information, but you probably remember the terms a lot longer and a lot easier when they directly apply to you. If you've made meaning of them or made them somehow self-referent to you. Okay, so just keep that in mind, but you can see the way we're moving is sensory memory, attention is paid, that puts it into working memory, and then through effortful processing, semantic encoding, we're able to move those memories over to long-term memory. So to become a memory, that information has to first be registered in sensory memory. And that means it has to be something that stands out in order to be selected for further processing. So 2 examples of sensory memory: iconic memory, and this is for visual stimuli. And I always tell my students, even though it's not spelled the same, when you think of iconic memory, think of your eyes. The problem is your iconic memory literally lasts for tenths of a second before it refreshes. So it's literally like a flash. Echoic memory, think about you hear an echo. This is auditory stimuli. Now, your echoic memory is a little bit longer. It's generally 3 to 4 seconds before it refreshes. So the example I always use with my students is, if your teacher or someone is talking and you kind of zone out, when you come back, you can probably remember the last several words they said because it's still being held in that echoic memory. So sensory memory is really difficult to measure, though, because as you can see, it refreshes really quickly. All right, so when we think about automatic versus effortful processing, this is a place where I always remind my students the word effortful is what it sounds like. Effortful processing is processing that you have put effort into. It's the type of encoding that's going to require attention and conscious effort. So 2 major types: maintenance rehearsal. Again, this would be just the simple repetition of information in your consciousness. So for example, you might rehearse your neurotransmitter note cards or vocabulary flashcards. Again, that would just be maintenance rehearsal. It's likely keeping it there in your consciousness, but it's probably not doing anything more than that. So elaborative rehearsal is going to be on a deeper level, and you can see it says deep processing. This involves processing information for meaning, and that's where that semantic encoding comes into play. So anytime you see the word semantics in virtually any context, we're talking about meaning. And here, that's going to be a way to help you more easily produce long-term memories. So this would be like coming up with real-world examples in your vocabulary notebook, not just the definition of the word that you're then rehearsing with flashcards. Automatic processing, on the other hand, is unconscious encoding. And a lot of times it's incidental or trivial information like space, time, frequency. You might be driving down the road and think, that's the third red car that's passed me in the last few minutes. Well, you're probably not driving and actively looking for red cars. There'd be no real reason to pay attention to that. It's just something you've unconsciously encoded. If you're trying to figure out where you left your keys or where you left your phone, you're probably going to be able to retrace your steps. And again, that's going to be because you unconsciously encoded that information. You're probably not literally walking from one room to the next and taking like a mental snapshot. We don't typically do that, but we do unconsciously encode that information. Another example of automatic processing is well-learned information. Now, the key here is if it's well-learned information like word meanings, that probably means at one time you put effortful processing into learning this information, and now it's become so well-learned that it's automatic. If I use the word cat, none of you are going to have to go get a dictionary and look it up. At one time, you wouldn't have known what that was, but now when I say it, you probably even conjure up a mental image to go along with it. It's been automatically processed at this point. Parallel processing, if you remember, this is going back to some of the Unit 3 material with sensation and perception. We talked about that example of parallel processing where we're processing information on multiple tracks. So reading backwards could be an example of this. It's not necessarily like a party trick or anything like that, but if you know how to read the information forwards, then it's going to be the same when you're reading it backwards. You're able to process it on that secondary level. All right, so let's look at another multiple choice question. Memory for automatic activities such as bike riding and handwriting is known as. All right, looking good. Most of you are on the right track here. It is procedural. Here's something to keep in mind when you're talking about automatic processing. A lot of these do tend to be skills and procedures. So think about what bike riding and handwriting would have in common. Each of them involve step-by-step procedures. Probably none of you started out immediately being able to write your name or write the alphabet, just like you probably didn't hop on a bike and immediately take off down the road. It's something that you learn in stages. You learn the procedure for it. So when we think about those automatic activities, you may have heard the expression, you never forget how to ride a bike. And that's actually completely true. You're never going to get, once you know how to ride a bike, you're never going to get on a bike and not remember where you need to put your feet or where your hands need to be on the handlebars. You automatically do it. It seems like you're not even really thinking about it because that information is automatically processed. And that's the case with a lot of those procedural skills we have. So when we look at the structure and function of long-term memory, you can see the split at the top between declarative memory and procedural memory. So these are also referred to as explicit memory and implicit memory. And an easy way of thinking about this is explicit memory is knowing what, implicit memory is knowing how. So explicit memory is going to be, it's going to involve not just conscious effort, but it's going to also involve being able to declare or to talk about what you know. Now, it could be your semantic memory, things like language, facts, general knowledge, like knowing George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's a really commonly known fact that everybody knows. But episodic memory, I always tell my students, these are literally like episodes from your life. If your life was one big open book or a TV show, this would be, each event in your life would be like episodes from it. So episodic memory is going to involve, the time and place of certain events, your personal experiences, but there's always going to be some personal element to it. That's not necessarily the case with semantic memory. It's just going to be information that you've learned, kind of like Jeopardy trivia. Now, on the other hand, we have procedural memory, and you see it's implicit memory, knowing how. So these are going to be those procedures and skills we know how to do. What we might think of as muscle memory would work here as well. So motor skills, riding a bike, dribbling a basketball. Operant and classical conditioning also work here, especially with classical conditioning. We talked earlier about the involuntary aspect of that. You know, if you are afraid of little white furry rats, you may have no conscious memory of how that fear came to be. It's just something that happens, you know, that it's something that happens automatically and involuntarily. So that's why this would still fall into that category as well. One other example under explicit memories that we haven't talked about yet that I wanted to make sure to mention are something called flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories are very, very clear and vivid memories. It's literally like your brain took a snapshot of the event, and they typically are emotionally significant. For people in my generation, for example, you know, we may have a very vivid memory of 9/11, for example. I remember exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. Frankly, I'm old enough that I also remember when the Challenger space shuttle exploded. We were watching the takeoff in my third grade classroom, and the space shuttle literally exploded in midair. For my parents, it was when Kennedy was shot. So these flashbulb memories, like I said, they're usually something very emotionally significant. Even if it's not something directly personally significant to you, it's still a very emotional moment. So not only do we store that memory, we store it with those vivid details and with that emotional content. So when we remember it, we tend to, you know, feel like we were right back there again. We might feel the same way we did when that event happened. One big caution about flashbulb memories, though, no matter how vivid they might feel, like you feel like you're looking at a snapshot of the event, generally they're not going to be as accurate as they seem. Our memory plays a lot of tricks on us, and this is one of the big ones. Even though it feels very accurate, generally it's not. Okay, so when we think about retrieval, and this is literally like pulling, you know, information back to consciousness, we typically have 3 R's. We have recall, recognition, and relearning. So on the screen, you can see recall is a measure of memory in which a person must retrieve information learned earlier. And an example of this would be the FRQs that you have on the AP psychology exam. Recognition is a measure of memory in which the person needs to only identify items they've previously learned, literally recognizing them. So an example of this would be multiple choice, because even if you're not sure what the correct answer is, you can probably recognize, you know, maybe the correct answer from looking at your answer choices. So which one of these do you think would be easier and why? Okay, good. As most of you have indicated, recognition would definitely be easier because it's going to be something you've already encountered. You've previously encountered this information. Now you just have to recognize it. So of course, like I said, with a multiple choice question, you know one of the answer choices is correct, and chances are you've already learned the information. So you're literally just, you know, retrieving the information from being sort of cued for it. Recall is a little bit different. Although this is likely going to be information that you previously learned, you're having to retrieve that specific information without any real cues. So think of this like a fill in the blank without a word bank. Now, if you had a fill in the blank test with a word bank, that would be something called cued recall, where you have a retrieval of the specific information from memory, but it's based on this associated stimulus. So recognition would definitely be easier than recall even without those cues. And that's why for most of you, the multiple choice portion is probably a little bit easier than the FRQs. All right, so let's tackle another multiple choice question. In memory experiments on free recall, the recency effect refers specifically to okay, good. So most of you correctly identified that B would be the recency effect, although it looks like we were, kind of deciding between A and B. So here's the important thing to keep in mind. A is the primacy effect. Now, both of them refer to something we're about to talk about called the serial position effect. So you were on the right track, but the primacy effect would be the first items at the beginning of a list. And then the recency, think about the information you would have seen most recently, would be the items at the end of a list. So when it comes to the serial position effect, this is our tendency to recall best the first and last items in a list. And a good example of this would be the presidents. Just about everybody is going to remember George Washington, and just about everybody is going to remember, probably our last several presidents. But along the middle, you're not going to have a whole lot of recall for Franklin Pierce or, Chester Arthur. They're kind of the forgotten ones. There's probably a little blip in the radar for people like Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy, but for the most part, you're not going to have very good recall in the middle of that list. So this concept is part of the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus. He conducted many memory experiments, and you can see his picture over there in the top right-hand corner of the screen. So serial position effect was one of the concepts that he explored, but he also looked at, how rehearsal worked with retention. So he is responsible for why we know cramming doesn't work, something called the spacing effect. This is a tendency for studying over a long period of time, producing much better long-term retention than what you will ever see through massed study or practice. So although, and I've literally had students tell me this, it might seem like a really good idea to study in first block for the test you're going to have in second block, that's probably not going to have any really beneficial effects in terms of your retention. All right, so now that we have had an opportunity to look over some multiple choice questions, let's try a free response question. So with the free response question, we always start with some very general rules. So I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I am going to hit the high points. This is, not an English exam, so your spelling is not necessarily going to be harshly judged, but it does need to be close enough so that the reader can be sure what word you're talking about. You can only earn points if you make sure the reader knows what part of the question you're answering. If you choose to go out of order, so be it, but you better make darn sure that you've indicated what concept you're talking about, because the reader cannot make an assumption. You have to apply whatever the concept is to the prompt. For one thing, a definition alone will not earn the point, but you also can't go rogue and create a completely different scenario than what you have available in the prompt. One last thing, if you somehow apply a concept in two contradictory ways, like identifying both variables in a study as the independent variable or describing proactive interference as interference from both older and newer information, you're kind of trying to have it both ways. In that situation, the point's not going to be earned. So make sure that you're only applying it in one way and not just trying to kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. All right, so this is your free response practice for this evening. I'm going to give you a few minutes to look over that, and then you have about 20 minutes or so to respond. So take your time, not too much, but take your time, read over the scenario, and then make sure that you are especially paying attention to those bolded verbs. That's always going to be key. Make sure you know the difference between identifying and explaining. And Ms. Thrash and I are going to be giving you feedback on your responses. Take about 5 more minutes. About 1 more minute, guys. I guess it would be helpful if I unmuted myself. Sorry about that. So when we're going through each point, I'm just going to kind of go over some of the samples of correct responses. With independent variable, what I noticed in several of the responses was whether they received the instructions or not. Just remember what we talked about with contradicting yourself. The independent variable would have to be the thing that was changed. So was it that they received the instructions to form a mental image or not? You can't say it was both. That, for example, wouldn't score the point. So just make sure you're being as explicit as possible and go a step further. Instead of just saying they received the instructions, indicate what those instructions were. So you could have said the independent variable is the students being told to form a mental image, or you could have even said the independent variable is mental imagery, because that was really the crucial component that was different between each group.
I'll also say for making it easier to remember to differentiate the independent and dependent variable here, independent variable is always going to be what the researcher believes is actually affecting something. And it says it right there in that first sentence. Dr. Jones believes that mental imagery affects memory. That's what's being studied explicitly here. That will always be your independent variable.
Okay. So for point 2, most of you did really well with identifying the control group. Group B is the group that wasn't given the instructions. So they're going to be that group that's there for like comparison. So examples of correct responses. The control group is the group not being told to form a mental image, or for most of you just simply indicated the control group is group B, and that would have also been enough to score the point. All right, in terms of research design, the response needed to meet both of the criteria. It needed to indicate the design was appropriate because it was an experiment, and it had to indicate that the design was appropriate because it was trying to show cause and effect. So examples of correct responses that included the following. The only research design that shows cause and effect relationship is an experiment, so that is why the researcher chose this. Or this design uses the experimental method because you can manipulate one variable, the type of instruction, to affect another, remembering the words. Even if you weren't quite that explicit, as long as you were indicating that the design was appropriate because it was an experiment, and that it was appropriate as an experiment because the researcher was trying to show cause and effect, that would be enough to earn the point. But you need to be clear in adding both of those in. Instead of just saying it was appropriate because it was an experiment, you would need to go a step further and indicate, well, what is it about an experiment that fits this model? All right, when it comes to standard deviation, you just had to meet one of the following criteria. You had to indicate that the scores in group B were more varied than the scores in group A, or you had to indicate that the scores in group A were less varied than the scores in group B. So you can see either direction you went with that. You're not having to calculate anything. You're literally just looking at the scores and determining which one is more spread out or more varied, because that's really what we're talking about when we're looking at standard deviation. So some examples of correct responses. The standard deviation from group B is higher than in group A, so the scores in group B were more different from each other than those in group A. Very simple, it didn't even have to indicate the numbers from the chart. Group A had scores that were more similar to each other than Group B. Again, you can see there's no indication of the exact scores in the chart, but there is enough information there to show that the student understands what standard deviation is talking about in terms of that variance.
I will say one more thing before we move on to point 5. The only thing else I saw with some of the responses here, just be careful when using something like, oh, they're statistically different. So in this case, standard deviation, remember that's just another descriptor of these groups, just like a mean or mode. So that can't tell us whether or not they're statistically significantly different or anything like that. If you say something like that, just make sure that there's like a p-value associated, or it says something about it in the prompt.
All right, in terms of the ethical flaw, several of you pointed out that the researcher required the students to participate. So that would absolutely be an ethical flaw, because research has to be voluntary, or participation in research has to be voluntary. And you could have even said the researcher failed to obtain informed consent. Either one of those would have been acceptable. Like I said, most of the responses that I saw that correctly indicated this indicated the part about requiring the students to participate. One quick caution here, when you're talking about an ethical flaw, you always want to make sure that you're not going rogue, that you're relying strictly on the information that's provided in the scenario. Just one quick point about that. I saw one that indicated something about psychological harm. There was nothing in the scenario to indicate that. So even though that would be an ethical flaw, it's not an ethical flaw specific to this scenario. So just always make sure that you're using the information that you're provided. All right, for point 6, the primacy effect. So the response here had to indicate that if the primacy effect took place, the students would remember more words they heard at the beginning of the list than they did in other parts of the list. And this was one that we had just talked about. So maybe you were relying on the recency effect to help you there. So an example of a correct response would include something like, if students remember more words at the beginning of the list, then they've demonstrated the primacy effect. Just something to that effect. And I saw several of you indicate that they remembered words at the beginning of the list more. As long as you are clearly indicating the beginning of the list rather than the end, you would earn the point. And then levels of processing, this was point 7. So the response had to meet one of the criteria below. It had to indicate that students who did better, group A, used deep processing, or that students who did worse, group B, used shallow processing. And I literally saw some responses that just said group A used deep processing because of mental imagery and group B used more shallow processing. That would be enough to score the point. You can see the incorrect responses at the bottom. Students use the correct response at the bottom. Students used mental imagery, which allowed them to process the words deeply. The students who had no instructions did worse because they used shallow processing. So even if you're not using the exact terminology of group A or control group, as long as you're indicating the distinction between those two groups in terms of the way they process that information, that would be enough to indicate that you understand the difference between deep and shallow processing. All right, so we have now reached the end of the session. So if you would take a moment and let us know which statement best describes you now. And I'm already seeing an awful lot of very confidence, which makes us very happy. And keep in mind, this is a study session. So even if this is material that you haven't covered in great depth in your class yet, maybe this gives you some ideas about some questions that you need to take back and ask your teacher, or gives you an indication about some information that you need to make sure you're giving more attention, especially in Unit 5. There's a lot to keep track of with that memory unit. All right, so there will be a survey in the chat box. If you would click on that and just give us an indication of how we did. Just like we gave you feedback on your free response questions, when you give us feedback about how we do, it always gives us an opportunity to improve. And we hope to see you next time. Hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. We had a packed house. Have a great night. Good night, Abigail.
Good night.
All right, so help me out a little bit. I saw Jackie and I saw Kamisha. That was
That was all I saw. I didn't see anybody else either.
okay. Wonderful. All right, I'm submitting the attendance. Yeah, that was good. That was yeah, that was a big one. Monday was big too.
Yeah, Monday was big, but it's been a long, there was almost 90 kids in this one. That was really impressive.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to. There we go. Yeah, so I learning, they nailed it. I mean, they were doing so good with learning. I'm hoping that the struggles with memory is because maybe not everybody has gotten there yet, or they're just now kind of getting it. But yeah, I mean, I was pretty happy with Unit 4. And there were a lot of kids that did very well on that free response, but still a lot that were confusing things like dependent variable, independent variable. I saw several say controlled variable.
I saw a lot that were indicating one of the groups. Like group A would be the independent variable.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But as far as the last 2 points, those were pretty good. Those were pretty solid. And a lot of kids got standard deviation. I only saw a few where I was kind of like, I think you're just kind of maybe throwing stuff against the wall, hoping it sticks kind of thing. But overall, I think we were able to get to most of them at least. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like so many kids to give
No,
feedback
I
to.
went back down the list. It
Yeah.
really looked like we hit everybody. So I
Yes.
felt good about that.
I will say because I want to say session 1 week, Monday was a huge group too. I don't know about the rest of the week because I don't think I checked in. But I'm not wondering if we're getting to the point where we might need to do 2 rooms if we're not. I mean, you and I were able to get to everybody. Feedback wise, was that the case on Monday? Were y'all able to still give feedback to everybody?
It seemed like it.
Okay.
Yeah, it didn't seem like we were leaving anybody out.
Okay. Yeah, just, I want to be sensitive to that because I know world history had to open up another room. So I think we might be at that tipping point of maybe next year. I'm not sure, but who knows? All right, I'm gonna let you go to enjoy your night. Thank you so much. That was really great. And yeah, I will see you on Saturday. I'll text you and let you know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just text me and let me know what time's good for you. Like I said, I can just zoom in on my phone from anywhere, so that's fine.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right, have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.